growth. So turning to today's event, Roger Taylor, former chair of Ofqual, speaks for the first time on his reflections of the events of 2020 and the cancellation of exams and the reliance on an algorithm to allocate grades to individual students. Roger has worked in regulation in health, education, and criminal justice, and co-founded Dr. Foster, which pioneered the role of public data in monitoring health and healthcare quality. He's an expert in data ethics and transparency and has written extensively on that, including with me in various other organisational guises over the last few years. So I'm delighted to welcome Roger to speak this afternoon with you, and we'll hear a bit later from Anne Longfield and Neil Carberry as they set out their responses. So at this stage, I turn to Roger Taylor.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Sorry, I had to remember to unmute there. And it's a delight to be on this panel and to be here with Anne and Neil, and also great to be working with you again, I have to say. And delighted to be given this opportunity to share some reflections on exactly what's happened in 2020, because I think there's a risk that we don't take the right lessons from what happened, and if we make that mistake, we will continue to repeat the same errors. So I'm going to say a little bit about what went wrong, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think government and those of us who work in public administration should take from this experience, and how we should think about how we can do things differently. And then lastly, I want to just talk a little bit about what is happening generally with the use of algorithms in assessing candidates, in selecting people, whether for university or for employment, and to talk a little bit about what the lessons are that we can take from this episode and think about how those systems can be developed to work as effectively as possible to support social mobility, fair recruitment, and indeed the broader levelling up agenda. Neil, I should say, I just heard you talking on the CogX panel. I thought you were making some very strong points there on those important issues. So starting with what went wrong, the first thing to say is it's always tempting in these situations to blame the algorithm and say the algorithm went wrong, or to blame the statisticians, and that is the wrong response. I mean, to be clear, sometimes it is the algorithm that goes wrong. But in this instance, it wasn't the algorithm, it was the policy choices that were made. And it was, in effect, a gross miscalculation about what was a reasonable and acceptable way to treat people. And we need to understand how we came to make that miscalculation. So just to explain this simply, what happened was we cancelled exams. And exams are the legitimate and accepted way of deciding how we assign grades to candidates, and then use that information to decide important, consequential decisions about their lives. Most importantly, who gets to go to university. And going to a university, particularly getting a good place at an elite university, is a life-changing opportunity. And to be in any way cavalier or thoughtless about how that process works is a recipe for disaster. What we did is we cancelled that exams, that legitimate way of doing it, and we decided we were going to replace it with a mechanism that would predict who we thought was most likely to have done well in the exam. But of course we knew that it wouldn't be wholly accurate, and we knew that in many cases people would be given the wrong grade, that they would have done better in an exam, and that they would know that, but they would strongly feel it, and they would feel a deep sense of injustice. The extraordinary thing about this is how wide and deep the consensus was. This isn't a political issue. We don't Labour in Scotland, sorry, nationalists in Scotland, the Labour in Wales, Tories in England, all that. Well, everybody made the same choice and decided that this was the right thing to do. There was very widespread support across education, across higher education, and across stakeholders that this was the right thing to do. So it does require us to think quite carefully about how we could have collectively made such a colossal misjudgment. Another reflection on that is that it wasn't that people were blind to it. I mean, there was a deep sense of unease as this process was going forward, and a realization that people, that this was an enormous thing to ask of people, that they simply accept that this is how it has to be because there is a pandemic on. But somehow that did not sufficiently crystallize in the policy making and the decision making to recognize that this just wasn't going to wash with people. And so when that sort of misjudgment happens, I think we need to sort of think about how do we make that mistake? And I think it is indicative of a broader frame of mind. It reflects the way, particularly, that administrative and bureaucratic processes think about information systems and about data. And it is a frame of mind that is weak at recognizing the experience of the individual and thinking about it from the citizen's perspective, and which greatly overvalues benefits in terms of the smooth running of the administration, keeping things on track, enabling the systems to work as closely as they can to how they normally work. This is not a malicious frame of mind. It is done entirely with a view to making things work as effectively as possible, but it is a frame of mind that does result in really bad choices and can corrode public trust. So what are the lessons for government and public administration? So the first thing I do think is that we need to think quite carefully about the mental models we bring to these decision makings. There's a lot of commentary that sort of better communication and better engagement and better research would have steered people steered us in a better direction. I think that's true. I think that is right, but I think we can overestimate how much research and engagement can do if you're coming at a problem with a particular mindset. So I think we also need to think about how do we build into our thinking in a more structured way ideas around what does it feel like to be on the other end of this decision-making system. And just to emphasize that point, we did, with Ofqual, we went and did research with students. I mean, parents, it has to be said, parents were much more skeptical, but students, you laid out the options, you explained the rationale, and they kind of went, well, I suppose that is the right thing to do. But of course, that gave us no indication of what it actually felt like to wake up in the morning and be handed a grade that you just knew wasn't what you would have gotten, to have a huge opportunity taken away from you. So I think we need to think about how we look at our own decision-making processes and get better at thinking about that on behalf of people, as well as thinking about how we can better engage them in those decisions. And a big part of that is the idea of legitimacy. We are relatively good at thinking about things such as properties such as bias and fairness and accuracy, and thinking about sort of the properties of the system as a whole. But those ideas completely fail to capture the degree to which people simply regard something as fair, that they understand how they interact with it, they know how their own actions affect the outcome. And that aspect of it does not get the same level of attention. Indeed, it's sort of, there's a curiosity about what happened in 2020, in that people got the grades and they knew they'd been treated unfairly and they weren't happy about it. And most people leapt to the conclusion it must be because the system's biased. And what's odd about that is that the bias was one of the things that everybody was very focused on, had spent a lot of time thinking about how do we make sure it isn't biased. But it's almost that we all spent so much time worrying about whether it was biased or not that we lost sight of the much bigger issue, which is this fair at all? And as a result, ended up finding a way of imposing unfairness in a very even-handed way across the whole population. I think the other thing that government can learn from this is we need to think very carefully about how we think about data and statistics and information systems. And we need to get better about recognizing that these are not tools for government to enable it to carry on administering things in ways that are as convenient and effective and efficient as possible. They exist for the benefit of society and for individuals. And we need to think really carefully about, I think there's a lot of implications about how you then organize these systems, particularly in terms of individual rights to have their own information and to be able to use it, and the degree to which the knowledge about what is happening to people and to different groups in society, the degree to which that is available, not just to those who run the system, but to civil society and others across who may have bring different perspectives to how it's interpreted. And so lastly, I just wanted to say a little bit about what can we learn from this about thinking about the future of education and recruitment. And I think this is an enormously important question because digital and data-driven systems are becoming rapidly an important feature of how decisions are made about young people, and indeed about people throughout their careers, their working lives. And on the one hand, it is fantastic what employers and university admissions officers are doing to recognize that a grade does not sum up an individual, that grades need to be understood in context. And in the paper published, I sort of cite a couple of examples, a system called rare recruitment that enables an employer to take a view as to whether a candidate with a B from a disadvantaged background at a poorly performing school may in fact represent a much better hire or a much better admission to university than, say, somebody with an A from the top performing school in the country. So that's really welcome. And what's also welcome, I think, is the growing use in recruitment of additional mechanisms to assess different aspects of the individual. And those have been used successfully to diversify recruitment and to try and better identify abilities. But there is a real risk here because qualifications have an important aspect to them. They are publicly understood. They frame success and recruitment not about some inherent quality to you, but about a skill or an ability that you can be taught and that you can learn. And that's enormously important that these systems, if they are to be ones that are human friendly, that support human flourishing, in the words of the Royal Society, that they are not about trying to categorize people and label people, but they create the right sort of incentives that make it clear to people, this is how I can move forward in life. This is what I would need to do to be able to qualify for that kind of job. I understand why I was refused that post. I know what I might need to do if I wanted to continue down that road. And so it's really important that both that qualifications are understood in context and that people are able to interpret what the qualification says about the individual. But it's equally important that qualifications do remain a central part of how decisions about young people are made. And I think that we have a lot of work to do to think through exactly how we make that work in a way that is as human-centric and creates the right kind of environment for young people growing up and provides an effective way of opening up opportunities to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. I mean, I think some really key and clear points there, particularly around the weakness of the system in responding to the needs of the individuals and the degree to which, as you say, it overweights the smooth running of administration rather than thinking about young people. And so that's a neat segue into Anne Longfield, our former Children's Commissioner, who's going to talk about her reflections from the perspective of children and young people.
Great, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Roger. That got us off with some brilliant prompts for me, some that set me off a little bit more than others, but you might be able to guess what they are. I think the question is, does the algorithm work for us? I think the answer is depends who us is. Who are we in them? What we saw last year. And it wasn't just about this, it was about how systems get exposed during a crisis, really, with the pandemic, was that we saw a glaring exposure of where some kids fall through the gaps. You know, with the sites now on how you do build back better, how you do learn from the experience of the last 15 months, then there are some clear experiences here, as we all know, that can really help us take these things and improve them in the future. And I think the starting point, where does fairness and social mobility live in all this? Where's it set in all this? Well, I think, you know, there are judgment calls here, and Roger, you refer to it as policy decisions to be had. There are judgment calls about what ranking you give fairness and social mobility. You know, I would put them very high, but there are calls to be had here. And as all these things, there are pecking orders about what you choose. And I would say that fairness and social mobility didn't have enough weight behind it in terms of the ranking of decision making within that. What tolerance did we have for a failure in terms of fairness and social mobility? And I think our tolerance level generally is too high, but certainly that was seen in terms of decisions made. And I think the starting point is, as Roger said there, and really well explained, what this feels like from a system point of view and the process point of view. And there is always, it wasn't just here, but, this is always feeling that actually, if we can make the system work as well as possible, then we're doing something for the greater good. And, my message is, having worked in this, in work around children and families for 30 years, but as Children's Commissioner, where I could get to really scrutinise some of the systems in more detail, actually, they don't often understand the lived experience of children's lives or young people's lives or families' lives, and don't understand that actually they're a second order issue. Actually, the end product, children's outcomes, has to be the focus. And that drives us to interrogate and test whatever system it is. And I get it. Roger said that, it's not malicious in there, but I do think that processes and system concerns, above all else, are careless and can be negligent. So I would want this to be a wake-up call for not only this system, but wider systems, to really focus on individuals within it and what that means for their outcomes in life. Now, I think that means understanding the lived experience of inequalities and what you do about it. In this particular example, understanding what inequalities mean if you don't have the kind of home environment, if you don't have the access to learning, if you have huge challenges in being able to deliver that work. It means understanding what it meant not to get access because of not having the digital tools, and also not to have access because you were in areas of increased infection, so you couldn't take part in learning in the same way. And of course, most of those, or a lot of those areas, were in the north, and there were very strong positions being put forward, not least by the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. I think I was really struck as part of that whole process, as well, as how the disjointed thinking was in, again, it's not something that's just about this, but of course, discussions and policies take place in compartments. So if you actually are going to help children who are disadvantaged succeed, it's not only how you measure their success, it's also what you put in terms of support. And there are clearly fantastic examples of where organisations can really boost children's life chances by offering that support, and many schools do that, but that has to be part of a whole exercise. It can't be just compartmentalized off into different aspects of the education system. So I think that the lack of understanding of the lived experience really drives that ability to be able to make fairness a real test. And I don't think that we could see anyone really who was sitting there really interrogating that fairness. So for me, if it can pass the test in terms of being fair for disadvantaged young people, then it's probably going to work for others too. And certainly that regional element, very much a focus in there too. Just a few other thoughts to bounce in at this stage. The measure of success. Well, I'm sure we're going to hear from Neil about some of the changing elements of skills needed. But I do think this is not only an opportunity, but also a real need at this point to look at what are the skills that employers will need for the future. And they do go beyond a narrow academic set of skills. Of course, we all know critical thinking, ability to nurture, flexibility, problem solve, all of those things, which is why firms such as EY are going out. And that's something I think that we need to look seriously at what that means for the education system in preparing children for the world of work. And what I can see is that those children who are going to private schools or to schools who are very geared up about this are putting children at an even greater advantage than those that are in schools which may be much more about trying to get to first base, and kids that really do have their enormous challenges in themselves. And to look at the system itself, again, another question. We talked about, grade inflation. We talked about individual children's grades within that, but we still have a system where we think it's tolerable to have 25% of children who fail. And I think, again, it's a time to look at what we want from and expect from our system, and whether there's a different way of measuring progress, which means that as children come out of 14 years in school with tens of thousands of pounds being spent, that actually they can have something to show for that. So I think here we have an opportunity to learn from this. It was an enormous shock. We had a system where really we saw processes and technology taking over from individuals within there. And looking at what that means for young people, and I was interested, Roger, when you said you talked to young people about it and they thought, oh, well, this sounds okay. Young people aren't against using technology at all. But when they can see that it doesn't have anything that counters it working against them, then they lose all trust in it, just as you could see there, and with adults too. So if we are going to build machinery, in which it's almost inevitable as we move forward, and we have to make sure it works for the individuals, and it has that ability to be able to really ensure that children and whoever it is that's in that system doesn't get lost. And of course, that is knowing which principles, knowing which policy decisions are putting in the first place. And again, testing that system every step of the way. It shouldn't be a surprise what happens on a day like an exam day. We all should have thought of that beforehand. So what about the future? Well, this is about building back better. What are we trying to achieve? And if levelling up is anything, it must be about education, and it must be about social mobility, and it must be about fairness. How much do we understand young people's experience and lived experience of being disadvantaged in this situation and in their educational journey, the reality, and what are we prepared to put in to help them get there? I would say we need to be prepared to put in a lot. What do we measure? How do we measure it? Including how do we really support those areas where we've had entrenched disadvantage and inequalities over many generations? And again, plug in the North there. And how do we support children to get to that point as well? Progression is complicated, but it can be done. And this is the challenge I think we now need to set ourselves.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anne. I think you have also provided Neil with some further points if Roger's essay and his remarks weren't enough. I mean, the idea that skills go beyond academic success is something that the Centre for Progressive Policy, we are very keen to stress, and have done a lot of work on the role of further education and its connection with labour market outcomes. I think just broadening your point there about the percentage of children who are deemed to fail, I think the extent to which, as Roger suggested, a high quality university is the kind of golden ticket. Well, there's the question I don't think we've readily addressed yet, and that's what happens to the 50% of young people who don't go to university. And we're seeing the further education bill go through now. And as you say, if that doesn't link back to our education system, and if that doesn't link to some of the points that we're raising today, both on the employment side, the assessment side, and the role of education, I think we are going to struggle to meet that the ambitions that we have, not just in government, but across society for levelling up. So at this stage, I'm going to move across to Neil now and think about what all this means for employability, and how we can continue to have the debate so that we have a trust in our qualification systems with employers as much as young people.
Thanks, Charlotte, and good afternoon, everyone. Real pleasure to join you. Thank you, Roger, for the essay, which I think is a really useful bit of insight. And if you were listening to me on CogX earlier, Roger, you know I like a historical analogy to start things off. And one of the questions I often ask people to reflect on when thinking about how the British government makes its decisions is the question, what made the poll tax politically unsustainable? Because in the national consciousness, people will go straight to the poll tax riots. And actually, I would go straight to the Eastbourne by-election and the Mid-Staffs by-election. Things become politically unsustainable when our people in our circle are saying this is an absolute choose your word show. And I start with that by way of saying, I think the algorithm experience of exams last year is, Roger, as you set out in your essay, a symptom of a wider challenge within government, and Anne has put her finger on it as well, which is limited ability to think about the lived experiences of individuals and to think about the system as a whole. And I can draw examples right now from what's going on within the same department. You mentioned a moment ago, Charlotte, about the 50% of young people who go to an underfunded FE system. I am the tired veteran of explaining in words of word syllable to government that the problem isn't an apprenticeship levy, it's the fact that it's cutting employer investment in training because of the way it's designed. But it solves the government's problem, doesn't it? It puts £300 million of free cash into the treasury to spend on other stuff. So we continue to do it and apprenticeship numbers continue to fall. That doesn't feel like something that's focused on the users of the system to me. So the exams example is a classic, is sort of the Eastbourne or Mid-Staffs by-election of this issue. And I was really pleased, Roger, that you put your finger on it. And the core issue is really to ask the following question: who's it for, really? And one of the reasons I've been in touch with this issue over the years is not just that I work for the Recruitment Trade Association now, and I've done various bits, including the Low Pay Commission. I ran the CBI's education program for 10 years. And the thing that ran through a lot of our team's thinking then is basically government views GCSEs as a school accountability measure. And if you view GCSEs as that and not as a way to accredit a critical point of educational transition for individual students existing in their own milieu, you are going to fall prey to the kind of groupthink errors that we saw happen last year. Now, from a business perspective, it's important I approach this with some element of humility, because we are not doing everything right in this world ourselves. In fact, there are many things that we are undoubtedly doing wrong in how we bring people through. But for relatively few people come fully into the workplace at 16 now. Actually, increasingly few come fully into the workplace at 18. So one of our big concerns is the gateway that Roger was talking about, because clearly we want to know who's operating on the level that is heading for the top of the shop, coming through elite universities. And we want that group to be as diverse and as open at the other end of the pipe as it possibly can be. So for us, exams really matter in terms of the pathways people get before they come to businesses, because we have no control or input over those really. But the other thing, and I think you put it quite succinctly, Charlotte, is there's quite a stale debate about words I'll put in inverted commas, being ready for work. And I hate that phrase, and I always have, because it implies that business and employment is somehow separated from society. The skills you need to be a good employee are the skills you need to be a good citizen. Of course, we need people to be literate and numerate, and we do want accreditation and measurement of that. There's a big question about employers are relying on GCSE maths grades for functional numeracy now. How effective that is as a measure is a long argument if we were to get into it. But that piece around, we need a baseline sense, but the rest of it actually is about how people will train on. And I think that's where, you know, if business makes the mistake of talking about people being ready for work, I think in the education system, there's a kind of category error in thinking that education ends when people come into work. We have to accept that people come in and train on. And so businesses now are looking at how we can develop people when they come, and we're looking for people who have that ability to grow and develop once they're with us. And that does absolutely come to the fact of, you know, the rare example, Roger, that you mentioned about how can we judge a 7 or a B or a 2-2 over here versus a 9 or an A or a first over there. And increasingly, we're using group work, group exercises, we're using online assessment. I, you know, run an Ofqual accredited assessment organization for our industry, and all our exams are done online and remotely invigilated at the moment. So there are things happening in business that, you know, GCSEs, for instance, are of a different order, but I think there's innovation there that we can reach for if we keep coming back to what is the pathway we want to give young people through the system. Because the most important thing is sustainability for young people. And I think that requires, and this is probably where I'm a little more pessimistic than I am optimistic, it requires us to stop playing to the electors of Eastbourne on some elements of how we talk about education. And I say this as someone who's always held this view, not just because I have children approaching GCSE in the next couple of years, but I know there's tons you can write about GCSE grade comparability year on year and how it's all getting softer and how the media will write that up. But there is a responsibility on us all to acknowledge the good work that schools do, to acknowledge the difficulty of that work, and to be boosters for our education system in putting children at the heart of it. Because ultimately, the only thing business is looking for in all of this is a really broad pipeline of people who are in good hands as they come through the system, so that they find themselves in the beginning of our pipeline, where we can then apply some of these new technologies to judge people on long-term potential, not just what they've regurgitated in an exam hall over 3 hours. So really interested in coming into the debate, but I think Roger's essay is a contribution on the question of exam reform, but I think it's really important that we view it as a contribution on the question of the reform of the UK government, as well, as Anne's pointed out, especially at a moment like this, when we know that the shape of the state going forward will be fundamentally reshaped by Brexit and by the pandemic.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Neil. Well, we've covered a real range of issues as I expected and hoped for. Everything from the apprenticeship levy, the role that GCSEs plays, through to then the kind of finer, more technical points around how the algorithm works or didn't. At this stage, I actually want to bring in a few questions from the Q&A that deal with the algorithm specifically and the role of Ofqual. Before then, I go into a bit more of a debate. So I'm going to come back to Roger on these specifics. So with thanks to people who've raised their questions in the chat function, I think there are a couple of themes. So that the first one is, could the algorithm, even if you're saying that the results of last year's situation weren't necessarily the fault of the algorithm, but do you think Ofqual could have designed a more sophisticated algorithm, and what more data do you think would have enabled a more predictive process, one that could have been more, or one that could have been more, human-centric, to use your phrase? Do you think it would have been possible to design that in the time available?
Yep. So sorry, just it's getting a bit noisy here. So I think that is missing the point. Yep. You definitely more. I mean, I'm sure it's possible somebody might, that somebody else might have come up with a better algorithm. It wouldn't, frankly, have made any difference to the legitimacy of the process while there was a cap on the. It's important to remember the actual accuracy of the algorithm. I mean, there's an interesting point that Ofqual pointed out, which is, given that an exam grade is an imperfect estimate of some kind of notional true grade, and given the accuracy of the algorithm, it's quite likely that actually the algorithm was in some sense more accurate than exams, but that's irrelevant because it's the experience and how you interact with this thing. And so saying, well, it's more accurate wouldn't really fix that. Everyone who got a grade lower than they thought they should have got believed it to be true, and we can't tell which ones were right and which ones are wrong. So they're all equally legitimate in saying you have treated me unreasonably. So I think more accuracy, however done, and it's difficult to do it without them getting into quite questionable practices of personal profiling, and so it's quite hard to do it without becoming invasive. The algorithm was designed effectively to adjust what a teacher's view of the students was, not to try and make an individual student prediction. That's the first point to make. But the second point to make is, a decision that said, well, we are going to allow a higher level of grade inflation, or we're going to allow a mechanism that will enable more people to progress to university, but still use an algorithm to even that out. I mean, that is what happened in Ireland, and it worked. I mean, if you look at Ireland and France, they both used teacher assessed grades that were moderated. France, it was moderated by humans. Ireland, it was moderated by an algorithm. They were both acceptable, but the common feature was that both had a significant degree of inflation and a significant increase in university places. And that is the aspect that made it acceptable. It's also interesting to note in Ireland that this happened due to a last-minute U-turn. So they actually implemented an algorithm that was rather sort of, I mean, very questionable in terms of its distributional impact. But if Ofqual had been set the task of designing an algorithm where there was a decision in advance, well, look, we simply can't just, given that we don't really know who should go to university, we obviously can't tell this many people that they've lost out. If we say, well, look, we're going to address that directly, and then you could build an algorithm that attempted to be fair in the distribution of grades and places on that basis. It wouldn't need to be more sophisticated. It would just be doing something that people would regard as fairer.
On that, so, I mean, I think one of the key points that you're making is that if policymakers had lifted the cap on university places, you would have taken a chunk, at least, of the unfairness out, because more students could have gone on to university, regardless of the grades that they were ultimately awarded through that algorithm. I guess the flip side to the conversation that we've also had is, well, what about those people who are then stuck effectively with grades that wouldn't get them to university, but aren't going to necessarily get them into a viable, high quality further education and employment route?
So this is a very interesting question, and I think there's a really important point to make here, which is, and particularly I think some of Anne's comments sort of raise this issue. It's really important to understand that a system of assessment, I mean, firstly say, I don't think it's really fair to say things like critical thinking or problem solving aren't academic skills. I mean, those are exactly the skills you do learn if you do a geography A level or a maths GCSE. There is there's sometimes a temptation to say that because there are attainment gaps, because people from disadvantaged backgrounds do less well on these qualifications, that they are somehow unfair. And I think the issue here is, I think we get ourselves into very deep trouble if we start to think that what we're looking for is an assessment system that disguises what are real differences in educational attainment. So we need to have a system that's kind of tells you the truth about how well a kid can do on an exam paper, but we also then need to overlay on that recruitment mechanisms and university admissions mechanisms that understand the context in which that grade was achieved, and where decisions are made that recognize these differences and make fair decisions. I personally feel if we go down the road of saying we're going to try and have assessments that take into account your learning experience or your disadvantage, we'll get ourselves into a right pickle.
Well, I mean, if we think about Neil's point on GCSEs being a school accountability measure, I mean, we have tried and played around with contextual value added measures previously, and we know about Progress 8 and the rest. So we do try and do that to an extent.
That's in the accountability mechanism. Whereas obviously the more consequential thing for the student is the recruitment mechanism. But sorry, I also didn't quite answer your question, which I thought both Anne and Neil were really strong on, which is this point about, look, although university admission tends to be the point at which people, particularly in terms of sensitivity and public's outrage at what happened last year. The broader notion of, well, how well is this system working for people who the other 50%, as you put it, I think is an absolutely crucial question, and it's got a number of elements to it. One of which is what is available to them. Another key issue for me is the difficulty of navigating that terrain. And while I think, for example, the introduction of T levels is hugely welcome, it is nonetheless a large qualification that is the size of 3 A levels and is not going to work for a very large number of people in that 50%. So we do need to think quite hard about the way that, and I thought Joe Johnson's comments this week about the growth of micro-credentials, and do we have an education system that is thinking about supporting students through those mechanisms? Are we thinking about how this links into lifelong learning and recognizing that, you know, this can't be a one-shot chance. You get to 18, you had your chance, and now your life's fixed. I think those considerations, those are areas where technology has a huge amount to offer in making pathways navigable and fairer.
Thanks, Roger. Well, as a quick CPP plug, we're actually publishing a paper that looks at the educational attainment gaps and starts to think about how we can fill them, and micro-credentialing could be one of those ways. I'm going to turn to get some thoughts from Anne and Neil just on what you said in response to those. Before then, I go to Michelle Zahar and Nick Timmins to come in to ask their questions live on the AV. So Anne first. Any reflections on Roger?
Yes, of course. Sorry. So, I mean, I think for me, so much of it ultimately comes back to how much do you want to do this, and what do you want to do most? Because, you know, in any kind of system, and especially obviously within the political dimension, it's what actually is your burning desire to really achieve that gets the priority. And Neil's point about, you know, the system as a whole actually needing to work together. So your point, Roger, really well made. You know, this is about measurement of actually what the position is. It's not, whilst you've got other aspects of it, you know, you've not got a magic wand, you can't put the world to right at that point. But actually, I would argue two things. One, last year, there was a specific context where a lot of children hadn't had the same experience and access to learning that others had. And we knew there were some characteristics of those children. I mean, you know, the digital aspect, but also the geographical aspect. There could have been the opportunity there to do some one-off, or, you know, by one-off, it might be, you know, within this kind of 3-year period or whatever, where we could have added some additional aspects there, which could have modified that, given it was such a stark difference between some children in terms of their access. But the other thing is, you know, yes, of course, that aspect where you are measuring reality there, but that then has to be connected to someone else saying, well, what does that mean? How do you change that? What comes next? What should come before? And I think the one thing that always kind of strikes me is, and it's a question really I'd really love to get your view on, what do you think where do you think that responsibility lies once you know something? Do you think it's someone else's responsibility to get kids to, you know, to fill that pipeline, or you just measure at that point? Or do you think that somehow, you know, Ofqual within that, knowing what they do, has a responsibility to start that conversation or further that conversation or drive it? Because as bits of a system living in boxes, it's always someone else's job to actually make them up. And my view of the world is that it's everyone within that's job to do it, because you can all see part of it.
And Roger, if I might say, we had a similar question in the chat, which was basically, should have Ofqual push back harder?
So my view on this is a really interesting question. My view on this is that regulatory organisations, you've got to play the function you are supposed to play in the whole machine, as it were. You can't start taking on, if everybody tries to fix everything, the world falls apart. However, that doesn't take away everybody's responsibility for the broader system operating. And it became during the recent years when I was the chair, it did become a real issue for us, thinking about, because qualifications have historically been seen as a tool of meritocracy, you know, a mechanism of fairness, a level playing field on which people can progress. And it's starting to lose that, and it's starting to feel like the opposite. And that is, to my mind, catastrophic, because if we end up with a world of sort of, you know, untransparent recruitment mechanisms that people don't fully understand, it will be soul destroying to just be constantly have computers say no to you, and and some professional recruitment systems can sometimes feel a little bit like that. So we do need to think really carefully about how people retain confidence that getting a qualification is going to develop a skill and they will be judged fairly, and that their life will be able to progress. So I think that is everybody's responsibility. And if it doesn't get fixed, qualifications will be the losers, and so will citizens.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good steer, Roger. And thinking about what our members at the REC do, and the future for us, that a lot of the narrative that we share with people is about, it comes back to the idea that this is a human process, not a fundamentally technological process. So the technology needs to enable the people to do the things that the people need to do, and that is a battle. There are plenty of firms who manage their recruitment through their procurement processes, and what they're looking for is lowest cost. Now, I can argue there's £7.7 billion of productivity for the UK available if you go for the value approach and broaden those nets out and do things more effectively. But that's a battle we need to win on the employer side. I think it's the same within government, thinking about the exam system. So, we talk about the self-improving school system, and lots of the kind of ideological thinking that stands behind the academies programme. I think there's an element of that to this as well, which is how do we make sure that whatever we do is properly not producer interested, because I do think the FE has a habit, particularly on the skills side, to be focused on producers rather than on the ultimate users of the system, who are the pupils and the students. But how we make sure we're effectively garnering and shaping that input, so that when we do bring things forward, whether something more AI driven in the credential system is 5 years away or 8 years away, when we do think it forward, the first thing people think is this solves the problem that I see for the young people I'm working with. The other thing, just to add, just to go to your final point, Roger, about micro-credentials, people are really excited about micro-credentialing in the private sector now. It gives us a massive opportunity to do effective right to work checking, and to speed the process of things like checking people's professional status. It's so important that we've got 6 breakouts at our conference at the REC next week. One of them is on that. And I think that piece around how can we bring blockchain-enabled micro-credentialing into particularly the upper tiers of the exam system is a really good live question for us to get our teeth into over the next couple of years.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Oh,
can I just throw one extra in, which is something that you said earlier, when really how do we rebalance what is scrutinized in huge depth and what we hold as important, from having that priority on university in the 50% to not only the other 50%, but that 20% of kids who actually will probably just fade away at that point. And on all the points that I've kind of raised, how do we move that so we're as bothered, if not more bothered, about that group of children than we are the ones that go to Russell Group?
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you. Particularly because I want to bring in Michelle and another question from the Q&A, which is getting at particular groups of children that might have been potentially more let down. So we've talked about the regional and nature of and the idea of disadvantaged versus non-disadvantaged households. But there's a question in the Q&A around SEND children, particularly those who are autistic. And Michelle, do you want to ask your questions? I think that's about homeschooling.
Oh, right, yeah. Or not homeschooling, home education. It's not homeschooling.
Oh, sorry,
okay,
I've got homeschooling on the brain after the pandemic.
Yeah. So within home education communities, they felt very let down substantially by the exam cancellations. It's left many without college and university placements. It's also left for the future less centres available for home educators and private candidates, as it is now viewed as even more difficult in case of future exams are cancelled. How are these groups being factored into future grading systems?
So Roger, I think this is one for you.
Yeah, so I'm not too sure. I mean, just one thing to say, I do think, because there's one of the issues around sort of the notion of algorithmic bias, I think was often misunderstood. And it's so, for example, Send, lots of groups that were thought to be being disadvantaged, like Send, actually were relatively speaking advantaged by the process of moderation. On your point about homeschooled kids and in 2020, which obviously was a huge issue. You've missed
the point. You've missed the point. Sorry. It's home-educated children, so they haven't got the support of a school in the background. They are purely home-educated, so they may not have tutors. They may literally be learning with the support of their own parents. So all the things that were supposedly safeguards, normally the children wouldn't do mocks. They would literally just sit the exam, and that's always been fine before. But then, like this year, a lot of centres took the students on when the rules changed. They actually just told the parents, no, we're not registering your children now. They were now too late, so they had to then, either they gave up, so they haven't been able to do anything, or they had to go to a different centre, now on a late fee, and normally more of an expensive centre. So it ends up disadvantaging even further.
Fine. Look, I'm sorry. I don't think I can comment on this. I've not been involved since last December in the arrangement, so I don't really know enough about those arrangements. What you're saying, I understand the point you're making, but I don't think I could usefully comment on it.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Roger. So going to Nick now. Nick Timmins.
Hi. I'm Nick Timmins. Like Roger, I'm a former Financial Times journalist, and these days I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, among other things. I guess it's a question chiefly for Roger, but given we sort of swung from one extreme to the other, from almost total reliance on an algorithm to an incredibly heavy reliance on teacher assessment, is this going to go better this year, or are we heading for another slightly different debacle?
I mean, there's definitely a thing that goes on, and this is why blaming an algorithm is not helpful, because it's a bit like, now everybody thinks an algorithm's like the lift you got stuck in recently and no one wants to go near them. So there's a kind of a bit of a psychological effect there, which hopefully will wash out, but it isn't useful that people are fearful of algorithms. In terms of this year, I think teachers know what they've got to do. It's not an easy task. They do have set work on which they're going to base their grades, and I'm confident they will do it as well as humanly possible. I think it's probably all I'd say about it at this stage. Again, I'm not involved in this year's arrangements, so I don't want to comment further, if that's good.
Okay.
Thanks. And we've just got one last question that I think is really appropriate to end on. So it's actually aimed at Anne, and Zoe asks, what impact the exam situation had last year? What do you think that will have on not just young people who are directly affected, but those in younger years who've kind of watched that unfold? And I guess that's a way of bringing the conversation to a close, because then I'll come to Neil first and then Roger to wrap up from a perspective of children and young people and how we take that forward. But Anne first, please.
Well, I think like so many other aspects of the pandemic was a huge shock. We all think how life is going to go. School's going to stay open. You're going to go to school. You're going to do exams because that's what everyone does. And then, something will happen. You may go to university. You might do other things. And of course, the pandemic has been a huge shock in all those terms. And if they've got older siblings, they will have seen what would have happened in terms of the way the system had to change at huge speed. I think that, as with so many things, means that children, part of that recovery that they now need is to really be helped to see, the path forward. The next few years aren't going to be back to normal in any way in terms of this, but also then to really have that clarity about what the future will look like, what will exams look like, what will they be expected to see? Because of course, what we don't want is for kids to just lose faith in it completely and think that exams are, not going to happen at all. And that actually there's no point in them progressing at this stage. Not that any children would, but it's easy to see why. So I think that clarity and that real understanding of the extent of the shock of the pandemic of the last year, and of course I would say as part of that, need to support that recovery in the broadest sense within education.
Neil.
Thanks, Charlotte. I think Anne's point's very well made, and I'm going to briefly, I was going to say briefly take off my business hat and put on my my sort of school governance multi-academy trust hat, but actually the hats tell me to say the same thing, which is what we need to do is appreciate what the path has been that different children have walked over the last year and a half. And if you think about the difference between even children of similar ability coming from similar income backgrounds, if you have a household where one parent works in construction and has been going to work throughout the pandemic, and one parent is either working at home or having to be furloughed to support education, that's a very different world to where both parents are working at home, or only one parent is working at home. The support networks for our young people vary very widely, and I think our understanding of the very different starting positions young people have, talking to one of the schools in our trust last week, bringing vulnerable children into school in the last lockdown has changed the perspective, because of course they've had probably more one-to-one time than they would have otherwise had. But if you look at some of the middle ability children who have got less support at home, they're in a much more concerning position. So I think everything that we've learned from Roger's essay comes back to this question of who's it for, and ultimately it is a collective effort, and we have to think about the collective, but it's about helping the maximum number of individual young people to where we need and they want to be. And I think empowering schools with the tools to do that is really, really important. So I don't often allow myself a personal comment on one of these, but it would be nice at being involved with several primary schools for me not to have to take money out of our budget every single year.
Well, on that, slightly fiscally dismal note, I might just hand it back to Roger for any final closing comments on the conversation and your reflections as you've laid out.
Well, firstly, just to say, and reflecting on Neil's last comment there, one thing that has resulted from the pandemic, and any child that's been, going through the last 2 years, or any parent that's having to deal with homeschooling, is a huge public appreciation of what teachers do and the value of education, which may have an influence on your last point. And also, interestingly, an appreciation of exams. So the Ofqual annual survey shows people are at much greater support for uptick in exams because they've experienced what happens when they're not around. I'm absolutely I do think, as Neil was saying earlier, I do think there's also has the potential to be a huge wake-up call for government and for education to start thinking much more constructively. I mean, just to be clear, I don't think there's any illegitimacy about government thinking about how qualifications can be used as a tool to drive high quality education. It's not that that is wrong. Yep. It's just that if that becomes the sole purpose, it becomes soul destroying for the people involved. It needs to be thought about as how does this help young people? How does it incentivize them to progress? How does it help them achieve their goals? And have we built a system that is really designed to do that? And I think if we look at it from that question, we'll realize there is huge opportunities for this country to think about how we could do that better.
Thank you, Roger. And my wake-up call to government would be, if you don't get that education must be core to levelling up, so that's more than just a political slogan that lasts from now until the next election, then you've misunderstood, what it is that we're all aspiring to achieve. So today, with the publication of Roger's essay, the work that's going out under the name of our lead researcher, Dean Hoffler, on this programme, and and further work to come down the line. CPP is really committed to making sure we reinforce that messaging about the relationship between early years education, further education, and the opportunities that creates for inclusive growth. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you again to Anne Longfield, Neil Carberry, and Roger Taylor, of course. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.